a disclaimer about my videos. I am not a professional by any means, but I think that students get a better feel for information if they hear it as well as read it. So I have short videos in each of the units. So this one is about Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment was passed by Congress and then later ratified, and abolished slavery in the entire country as of January 31st, 1865. The states ratified it. This is all before, remember, the end of the revolution. Sorry, the Civil War. That was in April of that year. So the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was already a done deal by the time the South surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Lincoln knew that the amendment to abolish would never be passed if the Southern states were to re-enter the Union and to end up back in Congress. So he knew that he had to get this done before they ever came back, because the only states represented were the northern states and the border states, and so in Congress. So they knew that they could get it passed, but they had to do it before the southern states got back in. 14th Amendment guaranteed the birthright citizenship for all males, of course. Federal protection of due process regardless of race, color, or your family status, meaning whether or not you were free. It was approved the 13th of June, 1866, and it did not become law until 1868. It had to go through all the ratification through the states. The 15th Amendment protected voting rights for men only, of course, because women did not vote. It prohibited federal and state governments from denying citizens' right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which included all of the freed and enslaved people, of course, because you could say that, you know, the race or color, if you didn't put in the previous servitude, that meant that the former slaves were not allowed to vote. So it was approved in 1869, ratified in 1870. The Supreme Court interpretation in the late 19th century, basically these guys were pretty much racist, and so they were not above allowing their own racial prejudice to influence their decisions. So you had a narrow interpretation of the Constitution at that time. They were not going to allow anything extra going on. They allowed, basically, between 1890 and 1910, you had black voters in the South who were disenfranchised by state laws and new state constitutions. Regardless of the fact that the 15th Amendment was in place, there was enough leeway in the amendment that states could interpret it as they pleased, and so they put obstacles in the way, like literacy tests, poll taxes. There were stories that they would force black voters, men who were going to vote, to register to vote. They wanted them to recite all of the names of the federal judges in alphabetical order backwards. You know, nobody in the world could do that. So they were putting up all of these barriers to this. White voters were exempted from all of this poll tax, the literacy test, those kinds of things. And so there were big issues with that. Now, in the meantime, it did suppress poor white votes, because the poor people couldn't pay the taxes and many of them couldn't read. So that was basically collateral damage as they tried to, stop black voters from voting. That also included many poor white people as well. And so, but they weren't really worried about that. As long as they stopped the blacks from voting, that was really all they were concerned about. Radical Republicans, and they were pretty radical for their time. They wouldn't be considered radical today, of course, but they were. You have on the left, this is Thaddeus Stevens, and he is the poster child for radical Republicans. He was a congressman and later a senator, and he wanted the swift emancipation of slaves. He wanted the punishment of the rebels. He was all about sticking it to the South because they had caused all these problems. He wanted tight control over the former Confederate states after the war, and he was very much an abolitionist. He had a mixed race partner named Lucy Smith, and she later became a businesswoman and a property owner in a time when no women owned property really themselves, and certainly not a mixed race woman. He left her $5,000 in his will, so she was pretty much set. But she was smart, and she, as I said, was a business owner and a property owner, and so she did well for herself even after he had died. He treated her as an equal. He called her madam, and he took her to social functions and things like that. So there was no question for him. He was truly a believer in racial equality, and that was most of the abolitionists. Even they were abolitionists, they didn't necessarily believe that African Americans were equal to white people. So racial prejudice was an issue even within the abolitionist movement. But the abolitionists basically believed that it was against their Christian principles to own slaves, and so they thought they would go to hell for owning slaves. So the New England states, right after the Revolution, had started abolishing slavery in their own states one by one. But that didn't mean that they thought that blacks were equal, and there was still plenty of discrimination in the North, even though the blacks were free. This is Charles Sumner, and he was from Massachusetts. Thaddeus Stevens was from Pennsylvania, but Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts, and he was also a staunch radical Republican as well. Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. Okay, so Lincoln had a Reconstruction Plan, and people thought that it was really too easy, that he was trying to go too easy on the southern states. What he really felt like was that it wouldn't serve any purpose to alienate the southern states, and that he wanted, these were their brothers, and he wanted to get them back into the Union and get things going again, because really the United States needed an economy boost at this point, because the Civil War had stopped basically everything, and so the nation needed to get the economy going again, and so he wanted things back to normal. Well, once he was assassinated, his plan was out the door. And so Johnson had a Reconstruction plan called Presidential Reconstruction, and actually Johnson had been had run on the ticket, obviously, with Lincoln in the 1864 election. He was from Tennessee, but he was on the ticket, and the Republican Party didn't bother to vet him to find out what he really thought. They wanted to get the Southerner into on the ticket with Lincoln, because they thought that would convince the border states to vote for Lincoln in the 1864 election. And so they didn't bother to look at his real agenda and what was really going on with him. And so he was actually, they didn't really think he'd ever be president anyway. So they didn't bother to really find out what he believed, and they were so interested in getting him into the White House. onto the ticket so that Lincoln would have a better chance of winning. Well, he was from Tennessee, and so Johnson was a closet Confederate sympathizer, basically. He wanted to go really easy on the South. He didn't want to force them to do much of anything to get back into the Union. And so, they were going to have to rewrite their state constitutions to include the abolition of slavery in every single state. They were going to have to set up new governments, and there was a lot of work to be done. And so they fussed because Johnson was giving them all a free pass, basically. He wanted to allow all of the former Confederate soldiers, to vote. Except for the very top echelon like Jefferson Davis, and he wanted to give them all this great, give them their land back and all this stuff. I mean, he was going easy on them. So he was going to give amnesty to all the Southerners who took the loyalty oath. They were going to re-enter the Union. Once they revoked their secession, they abolished slavery, and they were going to get the new state government. The financial burdens were going to be gone because the federal government was going to pay. You also so people didn't really like Johnson at all, in Congress particularly. Obviously, Thaddeus Stevens really didn't like him. The radical Republicans came next. But in 1866, you had Memphis, Tennessee, and I believe it was New Orleans. You had these riots, these race riots, basically. But they finally met, all the Confederate states finally met the requirements, and they didn't have to have any more intervention as far as that goes. You had white violence. They raped 48 women, dozens were injured. This was whites on blacks, not the reverse. Congressional Republicans proposed another measure. They were going to have to protect African Americans by enforcing this United States citizenship, and they were going to, the 14th Amendment allowing citizenship was really a big deal, obviously. Andrew Johnson said, no, I'm not signing it, because he was a Unionist Democrat, meaning he was in the Union, but he was a Democrat like the Southerners, and he refused to sign it. So it's basically obstruction of Reconstruction. Next, you have radical Reconstruction. The Congressional Republicans wanted to implement this entire program, and they got sick of Johnson obstructing all of their efforts to move forward with Reconstruction. So one of the big achievements of the time was voting rights for men, which was a big deal. But the problem is that the congressional ideas about what the blacks were supposed to be doing in the South was not what they actually wanted to be doing. As I said before, one of the main goals was to get the economy moving again, because in 1860 the cotton production was at the highest level ever, and so they're exporting all this cotton, which means there are all kinds of tariffs and all kinds of revenue going on. They were doing very well in the South. So what did they care if they were going to if they were happy to go on as agriculturists in the South, and they're making money hand over fist. Actually, the federal government was okay with that part too, because they were getting all the tariffs off of the exported cotton. And by the way, the cotton production levels never reached 1860 levels again, even after Reconstruction was over, and it's never been that high again. So the former slaves wanted economic independence, and they wanted to own a home. But what the Northern Republicans wanted was they wanted those cash crop plantations going with wage labor, because they wanted that cotton production back so they could increase the revenue and the tariffs coming in, because they needed to pay the debts from the war. And now that they had gone and assumed the debts of the Confederate government too, That meant that the Confederate States, that meant that they needed a bunch of money. So what they didn't really care so much about what the former slaves wanted. They wanted to get that cash crop going again. So you have all of these problems related to the fact that you get sharecropping going on. They didn't care that the slaves were not pleased with it. They were free, yes, but they were still economically dependent on white men who were out to basically gouge them and to suppress or oppress them all of their freedoms. So they were going to make it as miserable for them as possible and basically return the South to the way it was before the war, minus the term slavery. So you have this failure. Reconstruction was not a total failure, of course. You can look at it many different ways. But you had this problem economically. You have these conflicting goals. The lawmakers wanted one thing, the freed people wanted another, and you had all these Southerners who were hostile beyond belief. And they just wanted to go back to the way it was. So they were doing everything they could to also obstruct Reconstruction. So this was Lincoln's plan. Amnesty to most ex-Confederates. And as soon as you could get 10% of your males in the southern states to take a loyalty oath to the United States, then that would be one of your requirements that you would meet. State had to approve the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and they had to rewrite that. They had to rewrite their state constitutions. So they would take their state constitutions, write in abolition, and then once they did that, Lincoln's idea was you could come back to the Union, meaning your representatives would come back to Congress. You had the Wade Davis bill in July of 1864, which was Congress's idea instead of the 10% plan. It required an oath by a majority of the white men in the state. So not just 10%, because that still means you got 90% that say that they're not loyal. So they wanted a majority of the white men in the state to pledge loyalty, and that the new governments only could be formed by people who had never fought against the Union. Well, that's not very many people when you consider the number of Confederates who fought. And they also wanted the permanent disenfranchisement of Confederate leaders. So if you were a leader of the Confederate government, if you had served in a high-ranking position in the Army, you would never be able to vote again, ever. Johnson's plan. He hoped that that Johnson, you remember, Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865. That next morning, he dies at 7:30. And so Johnson is immediately sworn in as president. So he hopes that the South will accept the plan, and they contested it with violence and political action. His plan created state legislatures that moved to restore slavery in everything but name. So in 1865, they start establishing these black codes. And this basically is for the benefit of the plantation owners for economically. There were severe penalties on blacks who refused to sign full-year contracts as sharecroppers, set up procedures to take black children from parents and apprentice them to former slave masters, which basically you're enslaving their children, because they would confiscate these children and take them to work on their former plantations. And you have to remember too, not all Southerners were plantation owners. Plantation owners, meaning planters were people who had over 100 enslaved people. They were the ultra rich of the day. Because if you think about a young male who was healthy in 1860 would, in today's money, be worth right at $30,000 for one person. So if you owned 100 of these, you're not going to have only young males who are healthy, but you can imagine how much money that is worth in today's money if you had $30,000 person times 100, plus all of the land and your house and the crops. So there was a lot of money to be made. These people wanted to get that free labor back. They also later figured out a good way to do this, good, quote unquote, not really, but that's what it's, that for them it was good. They would take the prisoners, they would find black men doing really nothing wrong, and they would imprison them. Then they would rent the prisoners back to the former slave owners to work on their farms for no money. And so the owners would have to pay almost no money to the government to rent these people out. And basically, it wasn't the government; it was to the sheriff or the police or whoever was the prison person, and they would pocket the money, of course. So it wasn't like it was a formal deal. But so they would also, another way of re-enslaving these people was to take them for no good reason and put them in jail, and then put them to work back on these plantations. You had the Freedmen's Bureau that Congress had established in 1865, early 1865, to help these displaced blacks and other war refugees. In early 1866, they had to extend the direct funding for the first time, and at that point, they had to get authorized agents to go into the South and investigate all of the abuse reports that they were getting of abuse of black people, the way that they were obstructing Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau had several functions. They would go to the South and they helped people find immediate shelter, help people find immediate jobs, set up schools for children, because interestingly enough, the former slaves knew that education was the only way out for their children. And so even though they might not be able to read, they wanted to make sure that their children were taught to read, and that was one of their biggest priorities. You think about what you would be interested in as far as if you were being released, and how you might, you want a job and food and shelter. And yet these people were also very interested in getting schools established. So these children were in school pretty quick after the end of the war. They got these kids going to school because they knew, the parents knew this was one of their priorities, and they knew that that was a way for them to get out. Meanwhile, the parents also learned to read at the same time, because you remember, it was basically illegal in the southern states to teach a slave to read or write, for fear that they could forge their own freedom, their emancipation papers. They were worried that if they could read, they could figure out ways to escape, and so they wanted to keep them as uneducated as possible. Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared that these formerly enslaved people were actually citizens, and it gave them equal protection and rights of contract with full access to the courts, meaning they could bring suit, they could testify, they could be sued if if somebody wanted to, but it gave them the option to testify testify in court, those kinds of things. And this continued violence in the South just made the Republicans dig their heels in more and explain that they were not going to win this. The 14th Amendment was 1868, and it declared all people born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. So if you were born in this country, you were a citizen, didn't matter anything else. No state could stop your privileges or immunities, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny anyone equal protection. It was a major increase in federal power, because it declared when people's rights were at stake, national citizenship took priority over state citizenship. So it's saying that the federal government is much stronger than the state's government, and that was a big deal for the South, because obviously they were all about states' rights. So they were not too excited about that. Johnson opposed it, but public opinion was against him, so obviously it had to go. Congressional elections took place in 1866, a 3-to-1 Republican majority in Congress, which gave the radical Republicans a great deal of power. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South, and this is radical. This is very radical, and Thaddeus Stevens was the poster child for this. They divided the South into 5 districts under the command of a U.S. general per district. So there were 5 U.S. generals who were functioning in these 5 districts. To re-enter the Union, the former Confederate states had to grant the vote to freedmen and deny it to leading ex-Confederates. Military commanders were required to register all eligible adult males because the South had been resisting allowing these adult males, these former slaves, to register to vote. And so radical Republicans came in and said, your military commanders are going to oversee all of this. So they oversaw the registration of every man who wanted to vote. They put it in, they supervised that process. They supervised all the state constitutional conventions as they were rewriting their constitutions. They ensured that new constitutions guaranteed black suffrage, and Congress said they would readmit you once your conditions are met, and the legislature ratified the 14th Amendment in the states. At this point, as this is all happening, there were, and people don't realize this, I think, there were over 2,000 local, state, and national African American men elected to office during this period of radical Reconstruction. Now, after the end of Reconstruction, when the North pulls out of the South in 1877, the Democrats start putting this way back. They start putting it all back the way it was before. And that's how you get Jim Crow set up for the last 2 decades of the 19th century. But during this period, between 1867-ish and about 1875, you had over 2,000 African American elected officials. So there were many, many, many thousands of registered voters who were African Americans during this period. Andrew Johnson was the first man to be impeached in the presidency, which that has, implications for our lives today, because you have that impeachment, the impeachment of Bill Clinton, and now the impeachment of Donald Trump. So you have 3 impeachments there. And the only way Nixon got out of it was he resigned ahead of time. So Johnson was impeached because of high crimes and misdemeanors after he suspended the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and wanted to replace him with Ulysses S. Grant. He wanted to get rid of Stanton because he wanted to put Ulysses S. Grant in, and there was no reason to remove Stanton. So it was, obstruction. And so they were one vote short of a conviction of Andrew Johnson. However, he was allowed to remain in office, but he was a lame duck for the rest of his term. Congress showed what they could do, and he was a lame duck, meaning he had no power. People just looked at him, and that was about it. He had to, in order to avoid imprisonment, he had to agree to stop his obstruction efforts. So Congress basically put him in his place. By the mid to late 1870s, you had the economic recession of 1873. The economy was rough. You had people in the North who were just tired of the resistance by the South, and they were getting, they had been funneling money into the South from 1861 to 1877. They were just fed up after 16 years. So they were like, just forget it. So their resolve was wavering. And so Congress passes the the end of the Reconstruction in 1877, and the North basically moves out of the South, and things return to the pre-Civil War era pretty quickly. I hope that gives you a little bit of idea about the Reconstruction. There's a lot more to say about it, obviously. I highly suggest you read the text because it's most important, and I can't tell you everything in the book in a matter of 30 minutes. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.